Aloha and welcome to the video on biological evolution. The goals for the video today are to define evolution, state the two theories that came from Darwin's work, and finally to describe how Mendel's work supports evolution. Okay, so to begin, let's talk about evolution. Evolution quite simply means change. So when we're talking about biological evolution, we're talking about the change in a species. So whether it's developing a new species or breaking one species into two species, we're talking about that changes in the gene pool. Now, evolution isn't a new idea. It's been around for an awful long time. People have realized that things change in nature, and as such, the animals need to change and the plants need to change as well. One of the early ideas of evolution came from a man by the name of Lamarck, and his ideas were pretty well thought out, but his mechanism was a little bit off, and that's why he was misunderstood and why his ideas didn't carry a lot of credit with them. What he believed in, and his idea that we always use as the giraffe, is that you had some short-necked giraffe. Okay, now we took some liberty with the pictures, and what happened was that original short-necked giraffe realized that if it stretched its neck just a little bit, it could reach up into the trees and get these leaves up a little bit higher. So because it stretched its neck, it passed that trait on to its child, who had a slightly longer neck, and then it was able to stretch its neck and reach up a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit higher, and ultimately we ended up with a giraffe that way. Now, Lamarck believed in the passing on of acquired characteristics, which means that it's something that you would acquire in your lifetime you could pass on to your kids. But we know that's not the case. It's like if you're young and you decide to go get a tattoo and then you have kids later, your kids don't end up with the same tattoo. So that's what we were talking about. So he had the idea, he hadn't thought of how it worked, but his mechanism wasn't right, and that's why his idea didn't carry through. Okay, so when we're talking about evolution, this is the name you always hear, Charles Darwin. So who was Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin was a naturalist on the HMS Beagle. He was British, and you can see him right over here. Now, Charles Darwin sailed around the world. He left from England on the Beagle and sailed around the world. Areas of interest were the Galapagos, and we'll talk about that one a lot when we talk about evolution. But his job as a naturalist was to collect specimens and to take observations as they went around the world. And he did this with great detail. In the Galapagos, he saw a bunch of finches, his birds here, and you'll hear about them a lot as well. These finches were so diverse of a group of birds that it stuck with him. He kept thinking about this throughout this whole trip. But also, when he got back for about 10 years, he was thinking about it and came up with an idea of how it could happen and was trying to make sure that his idea was well-rounded before he presented it to the public. We see another individual down here. His name is Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace was also a British naturalist, and he came up with this idea of natural selection independently of Darwin. So he had actually came up with this idea and then contacted Darwin in a letter and said, hey, I have this idea. I'm not sure what you think about it. I'd love to hear back from you. And that was the catalyst that Darwin needed to present his work out to the public. So prior to that, he had been just working on it and trying to answer all the questions that people would have. And that's why he wrote his book on the origin of species, so that when he presented it, he would have a complete argument. And it was Wallace that kind of pushed him to the point where, okay, it's time to present this out to the world. So when you hear about Darwin, it was basically he went around the world, he got that what if question moments, and then he spent time trying to come up with a mechanism, and his mechanism of natural selection is one that we see that worked. Okay, so Darwin's idea on evolution had two main points. The first one was descent with modification, and that just means that species evolved or changed from a previous species. And we can kind of see what we're talking about over here, where we have a common ancestor, and then over time it was going to split, and when it split, part of them evolved into birds and the other part evolved into mammals. So descent with modification just means that as species evolve, they evolve from something else, but the reason we say they're evolving is because they have this change, this modification. Now, the other idea was natural selection. Natural selection is a biggie. That was a mechanism that worked for evolution. And what it basically says is that initially in each species there's variation. So we'll go back to the giraffes and we see we have a short-necked giraffe and a longer-necked giraffe. Now, the giraffes are in the same area. There's going to be some kind of competition for basic needs like food, living space, water, the ability to reproduce, things of that nature. So these two individuals were going to be in competition with each other. Now, the better adapted, okay, would survive. So that's where we see this survival of the fittest thing. So when we're sitting here and we look here and all the low branches have been eaten, that giraffe with a taller neck was able to feed up in the trees, so it has an advantage. It's able to live a little bit longer. It's able to get food and be a little bit healthier. Because it's able to live a little bit longer, or because it's healthier, then it's going to be the primary one for reproduction. And then if that's the primary one for reproduction, then this longer neck is going to start showing up more and more in the population. So natural selection basically means that nature's going to select which variant is better to survive, and then that survival is going to be passed through reproduction onto future generations. And that's how we evolve into a new species. Now, when we talked about heredity, we talked a little bit about Gregor Mendel, and we talked about his work with the pea plants and how he discovered that there were different alleles and the whole science of heredity. Had Darwin known this at his time, it would have made his book and his job a whole lot easier. Okay, Darwin had a hard time with how these ideas were being passed from one generation to the other. Even though that Mendel had done this work, it was still locked up and not shared. So it took a while for Mendel's work to find its way out into the public. And once it did, it kind of vindicated Darwin in a little ways in the fact that he was able to say, now I know it's right because it works this way. But we want to talk about how the importance of this goes through, because now we had not only the mechanism for choice, which was natural selection, but we also had a way for things to be passed from one generation to the other. So we weren't relying on acquired characteristics like Lamarck. We had the work of Mendel. Okay, so let's talk about the modern synthesis theory. And this is where we blend together the ideas of Darwin and Mendel. And this is our current theory of evolution. It has three different parts. From Mendel, we recognize that genes are responsible for the inheritance of characteristics. So that means that the alleles for a specific gene are passed on from parent to offspring. And that's how we get that genetic material going from generation to generation. The other part is that it happens in populations. Evolution isn't an individual thing, it is a population thing. And those populations are going to change in their genetic frequency based on natural selection and genetic drift. And then finally, we want to recognize that speciation is a gradual accumulation. So that means it takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes a long time for a species to happen. So that's it for our video. Good luck with the lesson, and as always, we'll see you in the next videos.